hard to make this series possible. Maybe a little applause for that. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this event. David Allred and the periodic tables made a significant contribution to help us with the food we all enjoy. And Trusa Service Club here in Oak Ridge has joined as a sponsor for this series. So thank you so much for them. One final little procedural note. If you haven't been here before, the way we handle questions at the end of the talk is we ask folks to fill out 3x5 cards with their question. And those will be brought up and consolidated and mixed and matched and asked of the speaker. So be prepared for that when the speaker is finished with the talk this evening. With that, I'd like to introduce Bonnie Carroll, who is a member of the Oak Ridge Breakfast Rotary Club. She's actually also the treasurer of our American Roots program, and she is also chair of the Peace and Social Justice Committee for the Breakfast Rotary Club. So, Bonnie, if you'll come up and introduce the speaker, please.
Well, welcome everybody. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce and moderate this session. Amid much turmoil in the world, we hope to develop a small understanding of one minority group in East Tennessee. Now, this is not a political talk. This is a talk about heritage and genealogy and people. So please, let's keep the questions in that spirit. In addition to learning today, I hope we're going to have some fun. And I think we will. Generally, when you open something, you introduce all the politicians and everything, but we're not going to do that because this is not political, except Ellen Smith. I saw you. Thank you for coming. Ellen Smith is our councilwoman. But I would like to introduce, as a way of context, that in the Oak Ridge, Knoxville area, there are actually 4 Jewish religious communities. 3 based in Knoxville and 1 in Oak Ridge. There's a conservative, there's a reform, and there's a Chabad, which is Orthodox. And in Oak Ridge, we are trans-denominational, and that's the 4th synagogue. And I will say that we have our rabbi here tonight from the Oak Ridge Synagogue. That's Rabbi Ahuva. Shake, watch. So if there's any... So a little more context. As of 2023, the world's core Jewish population, that is those identifying as Jews above other and all else, was estimated at 15.7 million people in the world, which is approximately 0.2% of 8 billion worldwide population. Israel hosts the largest Jewish population of 7.2 million, but the United States is close behind with 6.3 million. In the national context, as of 2020, as best as we can tell, because people today don't necessarily identify with whatever religion their parents were, 2.4% of US adult population, or 7.6 million people, identify themselves as Jewish. This includes 1.7 who identify as Jewish by religion, and another 0.6%, who identify as Jewish of no religion, because it is both a religion and a cultural identity. In addition, there are 3.2% of US children that live with at least one Jewish adult. Bringing it home closer to Tennessee, there are more than 20,000 Jewish residents. Nashville and Middle Tennessee have 11,000, that's 1,000. So therefore, there are about 9,000 living in East Tennessee. And it was interesting as I was looking at some facts that May is a very fortuitous month to have this lecture. It wasn't planned, but we have now found out that May is Jewish American Heritage Month. It's an annual, did anybody know that? There you go. We've all, Dale did. We've understood that. And it's in celebration of American Jews' achievements and contributions in the United States. The month was chosen due to a successful 350th anniversary celebration of American Jewish history. And in 2006, President George Bush made it into a National Heritage Month. So now, what about the local community that we all touch every day? That's what we're here to learn about. Today, our speaker is Wendy Besmann, who will speak on the Jews of East Tennessee. She's the author of the book, A Separate Circle, Jewish Life in Knoxville, Tennessee, and it was a University of Tennessee publication, and she received an award of distinction from East Tennessee Historical Society. Wendy is a longtime freelancer. She began her career writing about travel for national newspapers and magazines, including USA Today and Better Homes and Gardens. That's actually when I first met Wendy, and we took full advantage of that love and connection to travel. But those aren't the stories that we're going to tell from a public stage. Years later, she stepped up to a challenge in her life with a special needs child, and created a series of step-by-step workbooks to help parents of children with special needs find better services. She kept her interest in writing and lecturing on help for families with disabilities for many years. But then she sought her next challenge. In 2021, she earned a master's degree in public health from the University of South Carolina. During and after that degree, she became a researcher and did research under different grants. Her love of writing led her to the infamous idea of writing the great American novel. She said, "Don't tell." Well, she chose the subject, what would you imagine, 16th century Amsterdam. Go figure that one. And now I hear there is another one that may be in the works. She and her husband, Ted, a former group leader at Oak Ridge National Laboratory and now a USC distinguished professor, they split their time between Columbia, South Carolina, and their home on Melton Hill Lake. On Melton Hill Lake, she's a member of the Solway Navy. That's a group of friends who live along the lake. It is my pleasure to welcome author, researcher, not-for-profit champion, and a good friend, Wendy Besmann.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Yes. All right, good. We'll see if this works. I am actually Bonnie's neighbor down the road. So I am actually inside Knox County. I'm glad you brought me here from out of town. I probably should say, when this is a little misleading, the East Tennessee Jewish experience, even though I told them to say that, because there are parts of East Tennessee that I'm not going to talk about because I like to stay in my lane. And I did my research on the Knoxville and to some extent Oak Ridge Jewish experience. So I won't be talking about Bristol or Chattanooga, which have very significant Jewish histories of their own, and the newest Jewish community that is forming in Tellico, where I think you told me there are 30-some people there that hold Jewish events of different kinds. So we're going to focus tonight on Knoxville and Oak Ridge. Who here is Jewish? Who identifies as Jewish? A bunch of you. Who identifies as Jewish and lives in Oak Ridge? All right. What I say that's wrong, tell me later. Back me up. I'll try not to say it. But anyway, Bonnie talked a little bit about what the Jewish demographic looks like. One thing about being Jewish that I like to say, because in terms of talking about how we got here as a people, what our experience has been, we have to say something about how we are right now and who we are right now. And generally, I mean, Judaism is thought of as one of the three great monotheistic religions. It's often talked about as a religion. It really is not. It incorporates religions. It incorporates ethnic groups, but it's not an ethnic group. There are many, many ethnicities around the world. There are many people who weren't born Jewish that became Jewish. So what is it? Oh, there are many people who are Jewish who are atheists and agnostics and don't really think about it much, or what we call, cardiac Jews. They're Jews in their heart, or, gourmet Jews. They like Jewish food. But what are we, and what draws us together? The best that I could say, and I'm not the first to say it, is that we're a tribe. We're a tribe in that we're people that identify together around certain values, culture, and so on, even though we are very different. And one of the things that Bonnie was looking at is how many are we? I was surprised to hear that, because it's kind of hard to tell that the people that affiliate with synagogues, there's probably twice as many people who don't. And there's a saying that, anytime you have two Jews, you have three opinions. And that is absolute. Raise your hand if that's true. That's true. So that figured a lot in the history of the Knoxville Jewish community, which over 170 years was mostly in Knoxville and then in Oak Ridge. And that trajectory of the community has, well, I'll put it this way. My friend Barbara Bernstein, who knows Barbara Bernstein? Yes, she has lived here for, her family has lived here for well over 100 years, and they go way back. And she has always said, because she is a historian and gathered most of what now is in the Knoxville Jewish Archives, that Jews in East Tennessee are just like everybody else, only more so. And she was only half joking, and she was perhaps more than half right, because the trajectory of East Tennessee Jewish experience very much maps onto the trajectory of East Tennessee's growth and development and evolution from a farmland and merchant community to a hub for education, medical, and research. We tagged along with that. But within that, every group that immigrates to America, and those that were here to start with, they are united by certain cultural identities, but they're also united by certain traumas, instigating traumas. And in this case, way, way back, it was the Jews kept getting kicked out of places. They would get to a place, they would get settled, they would prosper, and they would get kicked out. So that's buried deep in the soul somewhere. And it comes out from time to time. And in fact, you can map the East Tennessee Jewish experience in Knoxville and later in Oak Ridge, more in Knoxville, by cycles of what I would call two things: a swinging door between opportunity and exclusion. So the door could swing one way or another, and this particular story is a story in 4 acts, having to do with opportunity and exclusion. So let's start. It starts right around the time of the Civil War. This is actually the siege of Knoxville, and over here is the way that Knoxville looked, looking from the south, from the north, just around the time of the Civil War. And at that time, about 7 families of Alsatian Jews were living in Knoxville, moved to Knoxville, in and out. And the reason they came from Alsace-Lorraine was that that was a part of France and Germany that keeps changing hands, and they got full emancipation by Napoleon when it was French, but as soon as it changed over to being German, they lost all their rights and started leaving. And also Germany was having a lot of Republican troubles, that not big R Republican, troubles with their republics. And that caused a lot of Germans in the hundreds of thousands to emigrate to all over America and also the South. Now, there were also, somebody was asking about Sephardic versus Ashkenazic Jews. The Sephardic Jews were the Jews that were descendants of people expelled from Spain in 1492 who went various places, and some of them came to America in the tens of thousands, starting about the time of the first settlement. I think the first Jews got here in 1656. But what you need to know is none of them came to East Tennessee that we know of. The beginning of Jewish life in East Tennessee was around the time of the Civil War. Now, one thing you need to know is that almost all Jewish communities in America that started during the 19th century had certain developmental patterns in common. And those developmental patterns had very much to do with their cultural values, what they thought was important, what they thought was practical. And it went like this. They came to town, they started businesses, and when they were able, they first developed a benevolent association to take care of the sick and the indigent. Tikkun Olam, the salvation of the world, the healing of the world being an enormous value, and also you had a bunch of people that you didn't want to have laying around your living room all the time. So you got to have some way to support widows, orphans, sick people. They start a benevolent association. That's first. They buy a cemetery because the Jewish rites of burial were very important. So benevolent association with a cemetery. The second thing they do, you think they build a synagogue? No. They start a school for children because educating children in their Jewish identity, in rituals, specifically in Hebrew so that they're literate in Hebrew, is extremely, extremely important. So, benevolent association school. Then, when they get around to it, they build a synagogue because they can pray anywhere. And they don't need a rabbi to pray. Any educated person can get up and do this. So they tend to pray a whole lot of places, and eventually they build a synagogue. And that is exactly what they did in Knoxville. In 1864, knowing that the Civil War was about to start, a cemetery would be a very good idea. They bought about a postage stamp size cemetery from one of the merchants. They paid $1 for it and formed this benevolent association, the first formal organization in Knoxville. And the first two soldiers to be buried there were one young Confederate soldier and one Union soldier, because, you know, as many of you may know who are interested in history, Knoxville was highly fought over, and it kept changing hands between the Union side and the Confederate side. And so there were definitely Jews on both sides. Now, one of those was Emmanuel Samuel, who you can see here as the old guy with the mustache in the center, being paterfamilias at a later date. But he had himself smuggled under a hay wagon with hay on top to get out of Pennsylvania to Knoxville because he had Confederate sympathies and things were getting a little heated for him. So he came to Knoxville and set up as a dry goods merchant, but his family said that he was very happy to sell blankets to both sides. So he did that. And he became one of the founders of Temple Bethel, which after the Civil War became the Knoxville Hebrew Benevolent Association became Temple Bethel. And they were they were in the Reform, the progressive tradition became known as the Reform tradition. Less observant, definitely letting go of certain like dietary traditions, of observances. They were actually trying to be a lot more like the surrounding Christian community now. The Temple Bethel is still there, is a Reform congregation. Reform has kind of moved back in traditional ways, but at the time, it was very, very much less so. It was really concerned with fitting in to the surrounding community. Now, here is Knoxville, not very long after the Civil War. It is a boom town. Things really opened up in Knoxville. It doubled in size in just a decade, and it kept growing and growing and growing all the way up to World War I. This is what I call Act One opportunity. This is opportunity. This was the place to go if you wanted to start a business. It was, you could see up and down there, they had a huge number of saloons, they had a huge number of theaters. It was the place to be. you had a whole lot of merchants, of German merchants, who were very well integrated into the community by this point. They were moving in, they started business. This is Mr. Lipner, who started his meat market on in the market house on what's now Market Square. And he was also one of the founders of Temple Bethel. During that time, somebody arrived in town who became very important to the community, and that was Max Arnstein. Max Arnstein was very educated, very cultured, very much, you know, of the German Jewish tradition, and he apparently filled up his wagon and decided to go to Birmingham because the whole South was exploding after the war in terms of business opportunities. And he went down got as far as Knoxville, and the story goes that there was a big blizzard and he got stuck. And then he decided this was a good place to stay, so he decided to build his store here. And eventually, he ended up building Arnstein's department store, which was the first skyscraper in Knoxville of 7 stories tall. It was really, look at that. It was the place that you went to buy your fancy French lingerie, you know, your trousseau, you know, your really expensive fancy goods. And that, of course, that building, this is actually a shot of the building as it is today, although it looks very much as it did back then. You can see Urban Outfitters down the ground floor. It wasn't like that when he was around. But I actually, this little side note, in about 100 years after he did this, I had my office on the 4th floor of that building after I came to town to work for a publishing company that became known as Whittle Communications. And I could look out of my 4th floor window onto Market Square that was the husk of what it had been. You know, like dried up, boarded up, a husk of what it would become. What it is now is a lot more like what it was then. So Max Arnstein became a very big, very big supporter of the community. Now, as we go on, a lot is happening. The German Jews are becoming more settled. They are becoming more integrated into the community. And what has happened next is another wave of Jews are coming because of opportunity and because they are being driven out from where they are. And those are the Eastern European Jews. And Eastern European Jews come out of Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Hungary, various other places like that, in millions. Many, many, many more than the German Jews, and many, many more than the Spanish Jews first came out. And looking here, this is the first synagogue from the Eastern European synagogue, the first Heska Amuna synagogue that was formed. It was on Temperance Avenue where Green Elementary School in East Knoxville now is. And this is actually the synagogue they had for 20 years. Actually, the rabbi lived there. It was a very, very humble synagogue. And the reason, the joke is, not only when you have 2 Jews, you have 3 opinions, you also have at least 4 synagogues. Because there's the synagogue, maybe it's 3 synagogues. Okay, there's the synagogue I go to, there's the synagogue he goes to, and there's the synagogue that neither one of us would be caught dead in. So the Eastern European Jews were a little taken aback by how assimilated and integrated the Reform Jews were. They had services on Sunday. They didn't wear kippot, the yarmulkes, the hats, and they didn't wear prayer shawls, talit. They didn't have bar mitzvahs anymore. They just, they didn't teach their children Hebrew. The Sunday school didn't even teach their children Hebrew. And so they started a more traditional synagogue called Heska Amuna, by which they meant strongholders of the faith, but it's actually a misspelling because they were not literate in English. But that's the way it is on our state charter, and that's the way it stayed. Heska Amuna. It's supposed to mean Haske Emunah, strongholders of the faith. And they did that. Now, the although the temple children were still meeting once a month in people's houses, this is how many of the Heskaluna kids they managed to round up for this 1901 picture, because educating those children was really, really, really important. They had a tiny little shul. Shul is the more orthodox name for synagogue, and they had all of those children. Now, you look at those children, and those really look like immigrant children, right? The German Jews were horrified, just horrified. They had all of these people coming to them. They were poor, they had weird habits, they dressed in a funny way, and they wanted them to either get with the program about being all-American or sort of leave town. But having a culture that very much has to do with mutual self-help, they did all they could do to aid that along. And one of the things they did was to support different organizations and businesses that helped Eastern European Jews get settled and get set up. One of them was the very oddly named Industrial Removal Organization, where German businessmen in different parts of the country agreed to sponsor people to get them out of the Lower East Side of New York and to get them settled around the country. The second one that was really, really important in the South was called the Baltimore Bargain House. There were two of them, Peddlers Supply and Baltimore Bargain House. And the Baltimore Bargain House, Jacob Epstein, had a deal that when a greenhorn got off the ship, the greenhorn was the new immigrant from Eastern Europe, he could go there, he could get a pack full of merchandise and a round-trip ticket from Baltimore to the South. And the idea being that he would somehow get out there and sell all the merchandise in his pack, and then he would take the train ticket and he would go back to Baltimore and he would buy more merchandise, and he would come back, and this is how he would get started and how he would learn English, and hopefully at some point he would start a store down there, but he would get out of New York, Baltimore, all those cities. And the German Jewish merchants helped that along as much as possible. This one here, who actually started his store, was Isaac Copeland. His granddaughter, Natalie Robinson, with Barbara Bernstein, her good friend, later made dozens and dozens of video recordings of Knoxville merchants, which very much helped me write my book because all those people were dead by then. The stories in my book come from over 100 interviews, which I couldn't possibly do all of myself. That means, by the way, that it is mostly stories. I certainly use documents and other sources, but they're the stories that people told about their families. Sometimes one way, sometimes the other. I had to figure that out. 2 relatives, 3 opinions. So anyway, one of the people who came through the Baltimore Bargain House was Sam Levine, who became important in the synagogue. And later on, one of his descendants, Max Arnstein, told this story in a taped interview done by Barbara Bernstein and Natalie Robinson. He said, the head of the Baltimore Bargain House was well acquainted with M.B. Arnstein, Max Arnstein. He told Sam, you go to Knoxville, it's a good town. They'll get you started peddling so you can learn the language. M.B. Arnstein fixed him up with a pack and a horse and a wagon. So he got it loaded with his pins and needles and threads and started down Gay Street over the bridge. Where to go? He don't know. As he got on the bridge, he let the reins loose. One road went to Alcoa, what is now Alcoa, one to the old Sevierville Road. He said to himself, whichever the way the horse goes, I'll go. What difference did it make? He had no idea where he was going anyway. The horse turned left and went to Sevierville, so that's where they went. Sam learned to talk pretty good, he said, and people down there started to like him. I remember, he said, Sam told me, I sold curtain goods to women who didn't even have a window. One of his new friends urged him to get into cattle, so he bought a steer or 2 and he sold it at a nice profit, and after that he was in the cattle business, and eventually he moved to Knoxville and started a business there. Now, of course, one of his other relatives said, no, it wasn't a horse, it was a mule. like horse, no, mule. And they had an argument about it, but that was Sam Levine. So a number of peddlers started that way in the Knoxville and East Tennessee area, going out to these back roads where farmers lived, where they'd never seen a Jew before, and trying to communicate with them and sell their stuff. Another one was Oscar Glazer, and we're going to put a pin in that name Glazer because it becomes important. Oscar Glazer was responding to another incident that happened. You know, here you had a whole lot of European Jews that had fled pogroms of various kinds of persecutions and poverty and various other reasons they came. And then in the before World War I, in the early 20th century, there was the Leo Frank incident. And Leo Frank was a manager of a mill, and long story short, he was accused of murdering one of his employees, a young girl, in the mill, which was not true, and he was acquitted of that, but emotions about it ran very, very high, and anti-Semitism was whipped up by it in Atlanta, and he was lynched. And he was lynched publicly to the point where people sold pieces of the rope. Now, as you might expect, this sent a chill through the Jewish population who could see that things were not looking good. And they began to fan out, and Oscar Glazer said, oh, time to get out of Atlanta. And he packed up his horse and buggy and his family and moved to Knoxville, where he rode across the countryside peddling scrap. That was a good business to be in. He peddled scrap, he collected memberships for Heskamuna in all the outlying towns, and he lived on sardine sandwiches and hard-boiled eggs, so he was able to keep kosher because he was a traditional man. And he did what you had to do to get by. His family said that you had to have a peddling license, but sometimes you did, sometimes you didn't, sometimes you bought one from somebody else. And he had one that he bought from somebody else, so he was stopped by a sheriff in one of these small towns and said, show me your license, and he looked him up and down, and he decided the sheriff could not read. And that was a guess. So he pulled out his license, and he says, here, it says Glazer, Glazer, where it really said, I don't know what, Levine or something. And the sheriff went, okay, go ahead. And it was told about him, though it actually might apply to a different peddler, who knows, that every time they'd be stopped by an official or sheriff, the man would pull out his pocket watch and say, it's 1:45, sir. And they would say, do you have this? And he would say, it's 1:45, sir, and smile very broadly until the guy went away. That's what he did. So they made do. Keep going the wrong way. Ah! So by the time of around World War I, you're starting to see that there's a big gulf between the German Jews who are at the temple, in Knoxville they call them the temple Jews, and the synagogue Jews, Heskamuna synagogue. And there were a big cultural gulf between the two, and never the twain shall meet. And you can see that they look very different. I mean, over here is a bar mitzvah, for one thing, is only boys, and they're wearing all of the traditional stuff, the kippot and the talit. And over here you have the first confirmation class of Temple Bethel, where boys and girls together, and they don't have bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and they look just like any other confirmation class in any church in town. And these two didn't like each other very much. So, by the way, this one here on the woman here on my left is Barbara Bernstein's mother. Barbara Bernstein's family comes up a lot. Now, what was going to happen next? Act 2 was going to happen next. Exclusion. And the German Jews had a little taste of this during World War I because there was an odd thing about names. Many of the Jews of Heskamuna, the Eastern European, and Heskamuna was Orthodox then, now it is a different movement, but they had names that were very anglicized. There were a lot of Browns and Greens and names like that because they had been changed, because they started out with names that had a lot of consonants that nobody could pronounce, and there was their names were changed by somebody else, or they changed them themselves, and in some cases, one of the member of the Green family told me they just bought the name from somebody, because it seemed better. Whereas the German Jews who had come earlier still had their German names, which were perfectly acceptable in the time when in Knoxville there were lots and lots of immigrant groups from all over the world. And a German name was okay until World War I, when a German name was not okay, and they suffered a certain amount of persecution and exclusion because of that. So what's going to happen next? Well, what's going to happen next is that anti-immigrant feeling is run very, very high after World War I, and the gates get shut. They don't give us your tired and your poor anymore. Immigration was cut off to a trickle, especially Jewish immigration, and the Knoxville and the Knoxville Jewish community basically, they were stuck with each other. There weren't a lot of new ones coming in. So they started, because they were getting more established as merchants and so on, they really started looking, over here, this is the Heskaluna Synagogue, and over here is Temple Beth El and their Sunday schools, and they're looking more and more alike, right? So over here, right in the front, this little cute little boy is Milton Collins, who will go on to be the Knoxville Jewish Community Center director and found a lot of the institutions of life. But you can see they're starting to be alike, and they're starting to get established enough that right before World War I, Temple Beth El buys a building very much with the patronage of M.B. Arnstein, and Heskaluna manages to buy a building of their own, and they start doing this is the Young Men's Hebrew Association and their basketball team. So they're starting to try and be as all-American as they can. So now here's what's happening. Anti-immigrant sentiment and cutting off immigration, and the start of social exclusion, what's sometimes called genteel anti-Semitism, which means you can't join the club. There's quotas on universities. You're excluded from certain activities. There are restrictive covenants in neighborhoods. Didn't happen so much in Knoxville, but it started to be felt. Lila Arnstein, Max Arnstein's very cultured wife, had helped to found the Knoxville Library. Suddenly she wasn't welcome on the library board. And Max and Lila started going, why do we need this? And they decided to sell out their store and move to New York, where they could have, a better life. And so they did wrap up and sell their, this very valuable department store. And they did that. He wrapped it up in 1929. Now, Ben Winnick, who was the son of the Orthodox rabbi Isaac Winnick, Ben Winnick was Barbara Bernstein's father, decided he actually had a plan. He was courting Clara Katz, who was the daughter of a prominent Temple family. They were like Romeo and Juliet, the two of them. It was shocking, but all of a sudden it was okay. And they formed the Progressive Club to have Jewish, young adults get involved with each other and do things. And they were starting to do that because they needed to be with each other. They were less welcome elsewhere, but they really wanted that. And so Ben Winnick, who was actually the kid on the left, but grown up, goes to Max Arnstein, who is busy wrapping up his affairs and selling his store, and says, yes, what we want to do is start a Jewish community center where Temple Jews and synagogue Jews can have cultural events and can get together and can learn things. And so Max Arnstein is selling his store. What happens to money during a depression? Anybody know? Okay, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. What's depression? Too little money facing too many goods. So if you are a person at the start of the Depression and you have a lot of cash, that makes you what? Very rich. So this is ironic. Max and Lila move out of Knoxville because they can start to feel the social exclusion and they want to go to New York where more Jews are. So they sell out their store in 1929, and all of a sudden they are sitting on a pile of cash. And Max, being a philanthropic person, buys the Jewish Community Center, the building next door to the temple, and starts the Jewish Community Center, which ever after became a place that the community could organize around, could have parties, could have social events, could circle the wagons in the face of this social exclusion, which didn't affect business. Everybody did business just fine. But it was the social exclusion that held up for several more decades. So that was, I thought, very ironic. And of course, Knoxville is one of the smallest communities in the country to have a Jewish community center. We really are this tiny bit, but the Jewish Community Center thrived. So what happens next? You have the 20s, the 30s, everybody struggles and gets by, you know, they do the best they can. The war comes, Jewish kids go off to war, the war ends. This is Gay Street. It's booming. It is a boom town. Gay Street is so crowded on a Saturday night that you have to walk in the street because the sidewalks are too crowded. When I wrote this book, I stood on Gay Street, and this is 2001, and watched a tumbleweed go down the street. Because all the businesses were boarded up, because downtown was dead. But this was Gay Street in 1949, and it has returned to this now. I couldn't have believed it as I stood there watching that tumbleweed go down the street. But what happened here is all of a sudden you are onto Act 3 opportunity. Big, big opportunity. People have come home from war, they have money, they are dying to buy all the goods that they couldn't get their hands on during the war, and the Jews of Knoxville were really willing to sell it to them. So there were dozens of Jewish businesses, and they went into certain businesses very well. They went into beauty supplies, jewelry, clothing, and in one case, music, because there was a man named Sam Morrison, whose daughter Mary Lyndall Schwartzbart still lives in Knoxville, and he had a record store on Market Square Mall, on Market Square, next to the Market House, before it was burned down by some teenager with a cigarette. And he sold records, and he had a loudspeaker that would, you know, play the records out into the Market Square area to all the shoppers. And so he also had the RCA guy, the guy from RCA Records, kind of, you know, thought he was a good guy, and when he did his traveling around the South to see what was going on out there in music, he would stop in to Bell Records and say, "Hey Sam, what you playing? What's buying? What's, you know, what are you selling right now?" And one time he came in and Sam said, "I got to show you something." And he picked up this demo records from Sun Records and he put it on the player and he broadcast it out to the square. And people started coming in and buying this record like crazy. It was Elvis Presley. And based on that, RCA Records signed Elvis Presley. So it all started there among the Jewish merchants in Knoxville. So you can see, this is like the Menorah was the first Jewish newspaper in Knoxville. It's got all of these people that own businesses up and down Gay Street. And one thing you can see, this is actually, there was a walking tour of Gay Street and this was developed for this. You can see Lipner's Fish Market is still going strong. Oscar Glazer with his wagon, you know, selling his scrap metal, has become Glazer Steel. He's gone, but his son-in-law, Buddy Cohen, came down from New York, built it into a major powerhouse steel company that is the wealthiest business in town now. But Glazer will get more important later. Let's put a pin in him. One thing you do notice is that professionals, Look at how many professionals there are. Now today, about 95% of the Jewish community are made of professionals of one kind or another, doctors, lawyers, scientists, educators. And this is how many we had. One of them was Ben Winnick, Barbara Bernstein's father. And there, we're Winston Vision Center, Harold Winston was there too. And you can see it hasn't really gotten started. Right over here in Morristown, there were furniture manufacturers who set up a big business there and made Morristown into another Jewish community. And they actually started their own country club because, why? Why did they start their own country club? Jews weren't welcome. So anyway, lots and lots of businesses. They had, this is Natalie Robinson's family, they had Sterling House, where you bought your elegant clothes. And she actually worked there when she was younger. You had Max Friedman's Jewelers. Max Friedman was, and now he has lovely lofts, his building is, but he had this very Art Deco sign, and he opened his store in the late 40s. And he ran for city council, and he was a local political guy. He was a big political guy, and he was influential in the Democratic Party in the state and also nationally. And it is told, the story is told, and it was in the New York Times, that Max Friedman actually was in a meeting with Roosevelt when Roosevelt said, give me a campaign slogan, and Max Friedman's friend had various other ideas like shareholders for America or something like this, and he said, no, what we need is a new deal. And Roosevelt said, well, that sounds good, let's have a new deal. That may or may not be true. The New York Times said it was true. I've heard from other people it's not. Speaking of the New York Times, one thing that I forgot to tell you about was Adolf Ochs, who was the son of not very successful German merchant, who started his business, who became a newspaper boy and then a printer's helper, and eventually bought the Chattanooga Times, made a success of it, and bought that struggling rag, the New York Times. And he made that a success, obviously. And he came up with the slogan, all the news that's fit to print, which they still have. His cousin Jacob, who had a cigar store on Gay Street and whose family in this time still owned that cigar store, immediately put up a sign that said, all the cigars fit to smoke. A little competition there. So there they are, being their businessmen. And they are doing very, very well for themselves. But one thing that is common, and Eli Evans in his book, The Provincials, which is about the Jews of the South, mentions is there was something they called the 5 o'clock shadow. The 5 o'clock shadow was everybody did business great together. Everybody loved each other. There was a whole lot of harmony. After 5 o'clock, everybody went their separate ways. It was the 5 o'clock shadow because, you were not socially acceptable on, in the ladies' auxiliaries, in the boards, in the any kind of organizations, definitely in country clubs. Cherokee Country Club basically invited Jews until, I want to say, the 1980s. The first Jews invited, actually the first Jew invited was Barbara Bernstein's husband, Bernie, who said, no way, we don't forgive that easily. Everything's okay now, but, okay. So, the Glazer family. Someone who became very successful during this time was Guilford Glazer, Oscar's grandson, who became an industrialist who pretty much built Century City, California, and was a land developer, and he was hugely wealthy. But he always believed in Knoxville and Oak Ridge, and here he was very involved with the Zionist movement, And here he actually brought David Ben-Gurion to Knoxville, which was a red letter day for the Knoxville Jewish community. That's him over there. And I just like this picture because over there on that's the far side there's somebody that the newspaper identified as Goldie Meyerson, but she later changed her name to Golda Meir. So that's her. Guilford was important in a lot of different ways because he was very concerned not only about developing this area, but about philanthropic works in this area. And to fast forward a little bit, the Guilford Glazer Fund now funds projects in Jewish communities. And the Knoxville Heskamuna got a very substantial grant from them. Take a message, the Guilford Glazer funds are still available. The Oak Ridge Synagogue might want to do that. But what happened next? Okay, what happened next was the tail end of Act 3, which was going to get to be Act 4 pretty soon. And that was the sons and daughters of all of these merchants went off to college. Some on the GI Bill, some with their parents' help, and Eli Evans, the Southern Jewish writer, said the story of the Jewish South is people building businesses their children didn't want. Here in Knoxville, and of course Oak Ridge was quite different, but here in Knoxville it was people running small businesses they didn't want their children to have because they wanted their children to have a better life that had less struggle. So they sent them to college in droves. And one of the people who went to college, I'm doing this wrong. One of the people who went to college was Mel Sturm. Now, who knew Mel Sturm? Oh, a lot of people. That's Mel. That's Mel right there, shaking hands with Santa. Because he's running the Sturm department store in Jellicoe. Though he went off to college and got a professional degree, he came home to take care of his family and to take care of the family business. And he started Sturm's department store in Jellicoe and became the mayor of Jellicoe. And he couldn't keep Mel down. Now, Mel, later on, went on to, I am so sorry. Mel, later on, went on to found a store in Oak Ridge. And here you have Guilford Glazer. You can't see him, he's on the end, on a very, very snowy day in Oak Ridge, breaking ground for, anybody want to guess what this is? It's the Oak Ridge Shopping Center. That's the Oak Ridge Shopping Center, the beginning of the mall. So you can see. And Fran Sturm, his wife, who knew Fran Sturm? Yes. Mel told me the story later that he went that she went to get them signed up for an apartment in Oak Ridge. And she came back in tears because, of course, you know, the gates were still up and whatever, and they told her, you can't have an apartment, you gotta be a scientist. You gotta be a scientist. And she was like, Bernard, we got this store. They told us we could have this store. Well, somehow they managed to get them an apartment. And Mel was always very tickled, you know, being an educated, intellectual guy, that he had book groups and study groups with all of these scientists, but he was the only one who wasn't one. And that he could do that and keep up with them. Because when we say peddlers to PhDs, the peddlers were in Knoxville, and you know where the PhDs were. That's right. So, what happens next? Oak Ridge happens next. I told you we were going to get to Oak Ridge. Only a little bit, because that's only a little bit that I know. And I want to put a plea out that people who have stuff that should go into the archives of the community of Knoxville and East Tennessee should put some of the Oak Ridge stuff in there, because I didn't have enough. This right here is the bringing of the first Torah to JCOR, the Jewish Congregation of Oak Ridge. As most of you know much, much better than me, many, many Jewish scientists came to Oak Ridge during the war, and some of them stayed. And they had Jewish services during the war, but they were very informal. They actually got a grant to bring in a rabbi for a high holiday for our most important services of the year, one year, and the rabbi had to go back and report to the funders that he had done it, but he couldn't tell them how many people came, he couldn't tell them what they looked like, couldn't give them any information about it because it was still behind the fence. But finally, by 1951, they managed to get themselves a synagogue, which they built by hand with shovels and bricks of their own. They are the only Jewish community that ever built a synagogue themselves by their own labor. So that's what happened there. Why is this not moving? Well, I've got some more slides, but I don't know why this is not moving. Somebody want to come help me, Mike? Okay. So let me tell you what's happening in Act 4. We're moving into Act 4, and Oak Ridge plays a big role in that. And I haven't got very many more pictures, only a couple, so it's fine. What's happening is, into all of this, in the 1970s, starting in the 1960s, going into the 1970s. Am I working now? Okay. You have a whole lot of PhDs coming to town. In Oak Ridge, scientists and researchers, doctors to hospitals, and the expansion of the University of Tennessee. University of Tennessee was actually kind of a backwater college, and in the 1960s it decided that it was going to be a world-class university, so it doubled its land acreage, and it brought in a whole lot of fancy professors from Yale and Harvard and places like that, which no longer had their quotas, and a number of those professors were Jewish. And in addition, so Oak Ridge had a wave of hiring in the 70s, and my husband Ted was part of that wave. He's old enough to have been part of that wave. And a lot of professors came into UT. And here's what happened to exclusion. It collapsed. Because, well, I guess why? Why did it collapse? Exactly. It collapsed because the cool kids didn't want to play. The PhDs, the very impressive psychology professors and political science professors and scientists didn't know anything about the pecking order, didn't care, and were oblivious to it, but they were the cool kids. They were the ones that Knoxvillians of the upper crust wanted to have at their cocktail parties. And so the system of the 5 o'clock shadow collapsed overnight. And that was a big surprise to a lot of the old merchants. Now, I should say that a lot of the old merchants in Knoxville really didn't care for the Oak Ridge community. Because 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and the synagogue we don't go to. They really felt they were like the solid merchant class, and the Oak Ridge were like the young toughs. They were like, we're young, we're educated, we're cool. We don't really want to deal with them. We want our own synagogue. And so that is one of the reasons why it developed in the way that it did. But you can see that, you know, these kids from the 4th grade are looking a lot different from the Peddlers. These are the children of the PhDs. And here, by the way, are is the J-Corps Sunday School, circa late 70s, having a Purim festival, the Feast of Purim, where the kids get dressed up in costumes. You can see that they all look very educated, that they're very middle class. They are really not trying to fit in. They already do fit in. Opportunity has come, exclusion has gone. We kind of hope it stays that way. But what you have left is communities, vibrant institutions in East Tennessee, the Knoxville Jewish Day School, Temple Beth El, Heskamuna Synagogue, J-Corps, The inside of Pescamuna I just put in there because it's pretty. The Jewish Community Center with its wonderful pool. And you've got this community that is very, very well integrated into the community. But it is also a separate circle formed by its cultural identity. And it's still a tribe. So, thank you. All right. What? Okay. I'm losing. You're watching. Nobody told me that it was going like this.
How was I going to tell you, Wendy?
All right, you should go.
All right.
Wendy, your scarf is leaving.
All right, now's your chance to ask any questions that you were always afraid to ask, but not political, hopefully. And somebody in this audience can probably help. And I just want to mention before I forget that there are books on the table outside, which is the history of the Jewish community. It's not a major scholarly work, but it's another community work if you want more information about the Jewish community. So, if you have any questions, you're supposed to write them on cards. So somebody will be coming around with cards, and then Ruby is going to triage. Okay. In the meantime, you also notice that there's 3 themes for every 2 Jews. Jews also have a self-deprecating sense of humor, as you notice. There's a lot of fun in that. Okay, here's a question. What got you interested in writing your book on the Jews of Knoxville?
Oh, good question. Yeah, we have a self-deprecating, basically I think Jewish humor is one of the only forms of humor that is based around making fun of ourselves, as you would know. I got interested in this because the late lamented community newspaper Metro Pulse asked me to write a long story on the history of Jews in Knoxville and East Tennessee, which I did. And of course it was because Barbara Bernstein told me to do it. And then on the basis of that, University of Tennessee gave me a contract to write a book, so I was hooked.
Okay. Any other?
I have one in a minute.
Somebody, yeah, okay. Okay, so here's a question. Of all the people you talked about today, who was your favorite historical character in the history of these local Jews?
Oh, goodness. One that I didn't even get a chance to mention at all because how much were you going to sit still for? One of my favorite characters is Bernie Bernstein, who, how many times have I said the Bernstein name here? Because he came to Knoxville on this wave of opportunity, and he became he is a lawyer. He was finishing up. He's from New York. He married Barbara. He came down here to finish up law school. He wanted to open his law practice here, and he asked his father-in-law Ben Winnick, for advice. And Ben Winnick said, it really is hard to have a legal practice in Knoxville because there aren't that many Jews. And who would hire a Jewish lawyer except for other Jews? That was like, it didn't happen, a Jewish lawyer practiced for Jews. Now, of course, Bernie went on to being one of the most successful attorneys in the state of Tennessee and very involved with Tennessee politics, with the Jewish community, and one of his best cases was he defended what then was the Gateway Books in Knoxville, and on obscenity charges. And he also defended a nudist colony. He was taking a lot of, he defended a nudist colony. And because he was a civil rights lawyer. So he didn't really know how to get up and do that. And Barbara said, well, just get up, dear, and tell the judge in your opening remarks that nudism is not my cup of tea. So he got up and he said, Your Honor, nudism is not my cup of tea, but still, and on and on and on. He won his case, and he ended up in Johnny Carson's monologue. It was going, there's this lawyer in Knoxville who says nudism is not his cup of tea.
Okay, back to the Oak Ridge. were there a lot of Jewish scientists that participated in creating the bomb in World War II in the secret city?
Well, okay, that's not one that I know a lot because I couldn't tell you how many, but there were a fair number because there were Jewish mathematicians, physicists, engineers that came in. And they had rather substantial interest in creating a bomb to drop on Nazi Germany, as you might imagine. And they were, you know, so they came here in fair numbers. And actually, Herb Hoffman, before he died, I interviewed him, and he said that of the scientists who stayed, most of them had never affiliated with the Jewish community before. They came from places where you just were Jewish because there were so many other Jews around. You didn't have to join J-Corps or something like that. And so this was the first place, in order to be around other Jews, where they did join a synagogue and became, you know, important founding members of synagogue, where they would never have done if they lived someplace else. So, you know, there were quite a few.
Absolutely. From the top to the bottom, I had an uncle who came who was just a serviceman that worked as a chemist on the bomb.
Yeah.
Unknown people.
Unknown. Oh, yeah. And while I'm thinking of it, Harold Winston, who was on that list, he was one of the optometrists, and he became a amateur historian of Knoxville history and gave me most of his files. The other one who gave me a great many files was Mel Sturm, who was very, very interested in Knoxville and Oak Ridge Jewish history, very faithful archivist. And Harold Winston said that during the war, he had a cousin that he wrote to, you know, like every month, and he'd get letters back every month, and he didn't find out until the end of the war that his cousin was here in Oak Ridge and he was in Knoxville because, you know, they weren't allowed to say.
Just a quick question of fact, is the Robinson family, you mentioned the same family as Pace Robinson of blessed memory, and his sister, Rabbi Razel Raphael?
Yes, it is. Yes, that's Pace and is the child of Natalie Robinson and is the grandson of Mitchell Robinson from Modern Supply. Yes.
Were educational quotas manifested in East Tennessee? This person is from New England, and he heard from many Jewish friends about being excluded from the Ivy League. Did schools around here, I guess mainly UT, do the same?
Not to my knowledge. It's possible, but UT was just not important enough. And so not that many people went to college anyway, not the children of merchants very much at that time. So I don't know that to be true. It's the Ivy League colleges that really did that because they began to feel that they had too many Jews, something that has happened to a number of groups where all of a sudden there's too many of you, go away. So I don't think that happened in East Tennessee.
Okay, was there any correlation between occupations in Eastern Europe and what people then came and did in the United States?
Well, that's an interesting question too, and I'm not sure I know. But I know that what Jews did in where they came from was very much determined by what they were not allowed to do. And of course, here in America, they were allowed to do more things. But the German Jews frequently came with trades, tailoring, you know, dry goods, whatever. The Eastern European Jews more commonly came with no trades. They commonly came from you know, a lot of them were able to tailor clothing and things like that, but they had to pretty much start from the ground up, which is why you've got so many pack peddlers.
I'm not sure exactly. What was the Knoxville attitude during World War II? I assume about the Jewish community?
Somebody had that question want to say? Yeah?
About like exclusion.
Oh, well, no, you don't get into the Cherokee Country Club, no. I can tell you, the first time I went to a wedding at the Jewish wedding at the Cherokee Country Club, it just knocked me over. You know, we just walked in there and we went, whoa, this is weird. But I think many, many things opened up during World War II. There was a great leveling effect. However, the social pecking order in Knoxville was still very much shaped by the merchant class and where you were in that. And that social pecking order didn't really change until the rise of the PhDs.
Okay, I've got two more questions. The question is, how does the whole story of the Jews here affect what's going on today? I would say 2 Jews, 3 opinions.
That's a big question, because what's happening all over the country, I think, is that there is a real evolution in the way people relate to their own ethnic and religious communities. Far, far fewer Jews affiliate with temples and synagogues. More affiliate in tangential ways with Jewish community centers or with holidays or with friendship groups. And so there's a great evolution going on in the community at large. And so we don't really know where this will end up. One thing I do know is that it doesn't seem to change the fact that we act as a tribe. And it doesn't seem to change the way, the cultural attitudes that bring us together and that hold us together.